Brian, thanks for joining us on the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Hey, so this is a fascinating book. I'm going to cut right to the chase here, okay? I'm going to read you a line. It's on page 30. This book triggered a whole cascade of existential crises for me about who I really was as a person. And so I'm going to read you a line that I think is what you're asking the reader to do in this book, Selfless. And you say, I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you don't exist in the way many of us feel we do, that there is no internal, stable, unchanging core you were born with that captures yourself. So now, listeners, you understand why that triggered an existential crisis, because he's basically saying you don't exist in the way that we think. Explain. This is basically what the book is about. But give us, what you mean by that.
What do I mean when I say that?
Yeah.
I mean it exactly the way you read it, that you think you're you in there somewhere, and you were born that way, and you'll always have been that way. You'll always be that way. And it's just not true. And here's the thing. I get the crisis it evokes, but if you think about it for just a second, it must be true. I don't know. Like what would it be to be some you in there that was there at birth? You even remember who you were 10 years ago?
Well, but that's a great point, because of what you're saying is, in some ways, this notion of a continuous, single, unified, self-defined self is a delusion.
Yeah, exactly right. It's useful. There are a lot of things that are delusional but still useful.
Absolutely. We had a book on the Next Big Idea Club called Useful Delusions by Shankar Vedantam. It was exactly like how we get through life through a certain number of useful delusions. But on this one, so we'll explore more about that. But what you're saying is that there isn't any kind of internal stable self, essential self, and that any kind of self that exists is constructed by our world. Is that a fair?
That's fair. Yeah. I'm in the book, I'm clear about this, but I want to be clear here too, that it's not like I deny a physical self. It's not that I deny there's some, physical body, their genes, all that stuff. But I don't think that's what people have in mind when they talk about the self. That's not what they're talking about.
Right. Now, what's interesting about this book. I mean, there's so many interesting things about this book, and I can show the people the millions who are watching on video. I've got 11 pages of notes here from this book, and it's not even that long of a book. I found myself basically underlining almost all of it because it really challenges certain kinds of conventions here about what we believe about ourselves and about other people. But to me, has anyone ever told you this book is almost like a work of philosophy?
Yes.
As much as a work of social science. You're smiling about that. How do you react to that?
I'm a social psychologist, and I think I'm more at the intersection of psychology and philosophy. And historically, psychology came in part from natural philosophy, right? There's a branch of psychology that is, derivation or evolution of philosophical thought. And I think I'm in that tradition in this book.
Yeah. I mean, certainly like William James basically began as a philosopher and then sort of morphed into being a psychologist. So tell me, let's get some background here. I wanted to explore some of the ideas here about the self and how the self is constructed and so many, especially very, I think, contemporary important ideas about identity. But how'd you get to this topic? Of all the topics in the world, how do you get to something like, what is the self? And is there a true essential self? Like, how'd you come to this?
Well, first, how isn't everybody at this? Like, what else is there?
Okay. All right.
But for me, it was, I think I say this in the book. I believe I say some of this anyway. I grew up in Chicago. I moved around a lot in Chicago, and Chicago is a very segregated city. And so when you go from neighborhood to neighborhood, they're like sharp differences. And I became really interested in making sense of that. Like, what are those differences? Why are they the way they are? Why are people's life chances so affected by where they happen to be? And how do we allow that to continue when it's so inequitable? So that's a big part of where I got into social science, is trying to understand the nature of our social experience. And as you get in, I'm really a curious person, and at another level, it's like, who are we? Like it's a kind of a natural extension of that. When you start to say like, wow, our life courses are being so affected by where we happen to be. What does that say about me and who I am and how much of me is driving my outcomes and the way life feels for me? And so I think it was really just that natural kind of extension of the question, why is my life experience the way it is? The next question is, who am I? And what does that
Right.
mean? It just takes you down a rabbit hole, and there you go.
That's super helpful because one of the things that I thought about in reading this in reading this book, which is essentially saying, art, again, I'm going to try to, I'm not overly simplified, but it's essentially saying that that we have no essential self, that our self is constructed by forces out there, whether it's friends, family, how we look to other people, and how they categorize us, and so forth. And so, to me, it goes to, I think, to the heart of your social psychology, to the heart of social psychology, which is in part it's about the situation as much as it is about the person. And so so you're saying is that so one question that I have is like, is our social psychology is about our behavior, but this is about ourself. So have you left social psychology and gone into philosophy, or are you straddling the border there? Are you on the U.S.-Canadian border with a dual passport, or what's going on?
I think I'm at the intersection. The questions that psychologists ask when you push them to the limit, they start to sound a little philosophical,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and I think that's where I am, and that's the thing I'm most interested in this book, where you see some of these neuroscience studies, some of these social psychological studies, and you have to ask yourself, like, wow, if this is true, what does that mean? If I can confuse my face with someone else's face, what does that
Right.
say?
Tell us about
Right?
that study. That's a fascinating one. That was alarming.
So there's
No,
a
it was.
study
I
where
mean,
they.
again, I'm sort of joking, but I'm sort of not joking about when I say that this book. I'm joking when I say it's an existential crisis, but I think that it inevitably inspires existential reflection. It's like you feel a little bit different having read this and thought about it and confronting it, because there are things that we might not want to confront. This idea that if I had a completely different upbringing, not only would my life be different, I think we get that, but I would be a different person fundamentally. That who I am right now is essentially accidental, or at least consequential, of all the experiences that I've had, and that's disturbing.
Yeah, I find it interesting. It's disturbing, but I do think that for many people, it's not how they experience themselves. And I love this face effacement effect, the one where you can confuse your face with someone else's, because it's just a empirical demonstration that the way the
Yeah.
world appears may not actually be how it
Tell
is.
us about that.
Yeah, so basically you have this effect where you just sit across from someone else and you're looking at their face, they're looking at yours, and then you stroke the cheek of the person you're looking at. Someone strokes their cheek, and your cheek gets stroked simultaneously. So you don't see yourself being stroked, obviously, but you see the other person being stroked. Or you're not stroked at the same time. So that's half the people simultaneous stroke, half the people not. And then you show them photos. And now the photos are interesting. So there's a photo of you, there's a photo of the other person, and then those photos are morphed at different degrees. So there's a photo that's 90% you, 10% them, 80% you, 20% them, you can imagine, all the way until it's 50-50. So there's a bunch of photos, and you show them the photos one at a time. And you just ask the person, just tell me when this photo is mostly you or not. That's the only question. So you're seeing a bunch of these photos come up, and you're saying, yep, that's mostly me, that's mostly me, that's not. If your face is stroked simultaneously with the other person you're looking at, once it becomes a little bit more them, let's say it's 48% you, 52% them, you still think it's mostly you. If you did not have your face simultaneously stroked, you don't make that mistake. You recognize that that's mostly them. And so it suggests even that little kind of watching the face get stroked is enough for people to start to confuse just a little bit, right? To include that other person's face into how they see themselves. And there's something amazing about that.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, it's just, it's extraordinary. I mean, so I'm going to raise another kind of philosophical question that you raise in the book. That again, I don't want to overstate my my being rattled here, but I don't want to understate it either. Right? So you ask a question. When you wake up in the morning and know it's you, what is it that you know? What's the answer? When we look in the mirror in the morning, all right, we're not looking at this morphed image where we're like, a mixture of faces here. When we look in the mirror in the morning and we say, hey, that's me, what is it that we know?
That's a great question.
It's your question. I'm just repeating it back.
Oh, thanks. Somebody had a great question there. The people who did that study that I told you about, one of the things they recognized is like this: there has to be some degree of flexibility in your recognition of your own face, because every morning you get up, you do look different, right? You're not confused. A week ago you look different than you look now. You're not confused about who you are, and so there has to be some degree of flexibility. So it's not just your face; it's the sense that like I'm controlling my face, the sense that like I walked up in front of this mirror, so that must be me. There's all these things that are kind of built-in theories about how things work that we aren't aware of. We feel like we just see ourselves, but there's a lot going on for that self-recognition to happen in that way. And I think that's interesting, and it suggests places where that can be not as it seems to us, because we're not really fully aware of how we're making sense of who we are.
Mm-hmm. And how are we doing that? I mean, part of it is perception. Part of it is our perceptual system, obviously, but part of it also is our social system.
Yeah, our memory, and it's also there's stability in our lives in part because we have stability in our social lives, right? I think that's a part of it. I think that if you move somewhere and really like all contact with your current life was cut off, there'd be some confusion for a bit in terms of who you were. Like you would probably not be quite certain. I don't mean that physically, but certainly there would be some psychological work that would need to be done to make sense of who you were in this other situation. And my guess is for people who have immigrated, they probably have a sense of that. If you've traveled extensively internationally and alone, like I've done that now and then, like it can be a little bit confusing after a while. So I think this is something we manage all the time, even as we transition to a new job or a new stage in life. I think there's a sense of reestablishing who we are, or a better way of saying it is creating who we are in that new circumstance.
Now, a lot of what you talk about in the book has to do with freedom, and at some level, I mean, I don't think do you use a concept of free will in here? I'm not sure.
I try to avoid it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Smart move. So, but you talk a lot, but you talk explicitly about freedom. And you have some interesting comments about that. Like you say you can't be free and have a self. What do you mean by that?
The simplest way to say it is like a self is a definition. It says what's in and what's out, and freedom in the most extreme way is being able to be anything. Well, once you're a self, it says what you are and what you are not, right? So it's a limit on freedom by definition.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, our self is inherently constrained because you have to have some boundaries on it. But
self is a constraint, right? I mean, and you want it that way. It's like it tells you who you are. I mean, without that, I mean, what would you be? And this is what I mean about freedom being something that, and the limit is not as positive as people might imagine it to be.
But you're also saying that we're created in some sense, or in a large sense, by others. Explain what you mean by that, because I think that's a new concept for a lot of people. And maybe give us give us an example about that. I want to get to some of the things we traditionally think about as identity, whether it's race or gender or so forth. And I think that can help make that clear. But to tell us what you mean about that, that we are in some ways created. Ourself is in some ways created by others.
So when you think about, gender is a great example. Most people have a strong sense of themselves as being a man or a woman. And obviously there's fluidity, and there's more of that today, and people talk about being, non-binary. But let's simplify for a second, and recognizing all of that, let's just focus for a second on just, are you a man or a woman? It's very useful for most people because it tells them where they belong. It tells them what people expect of them. It tells them what clothes they should shop for, right? And in that sense, it's defining. It helps us make sense of ourselves and navigate the world and relationships, etc. But then when you ask, where does that come from? You could say, I mean, what most people, not most, many people want to say is it's just biological. You're born a man or a woman. And I would say, like, it's true that we're born with certain sexual characteristics, but that's not what we're talking about, right? What I just described wasn't sexual characteristics. It's like, how do you engage in the world, and how does the world see you, and how do you make sense of things? And what I argue in the book is all of that is social, right? People tell you you're a man, or you want to be a man, and you present yourself as that way, and that dictates how you engage with people, and then you respond to how they respond to you, and all of that, all those things, that it is what it means to be a man or a woman. And that's hard for people because I think, again, people think I'm born a man or woman. And what I'm saying is it's really an ongoing process that you're doing socially. Like, you're engaging with people and they treat you in that way and you respond in that way, and it becomes stable, and you start to think of it as somehow inherently, it's in you as opposed to something that you're doing with people.
Right. Now, you also talk about it in terms of the biology of it being sort of the difference between what's sufficient and what's necessary. I think that to me was a helpful way of understanding it. That is, being born biologically a female is sufficient to have the identity, the self as a woman, but it's not necessary.
Right. So for many people, like, you're born biologically this way, and that's sufficient for you then to think of yourself in these terms and engage with other people in that way. But if you weren't, you could still have that same social engagement. It's certainly possible. And I think you see that more and more now in society. And from my perspective, that's what it is to be a woman, that social construction. And the sex doesn't dictate that that's not possible one way or the other, right?
It's the world recognizing you as a woman.
Yes. Right. So for someone like me, like, I was born physically male. I present as a man. I see myself in that way. People engage with me that way. So there's no challenge. It all makes sense. It's easy, right? So I can then think that I was born this way. But if I had been born physically male, but, engaged with people as a woman and people engage with me as a woman, then I'd argue I would be a woman, but I could see more clearly how that wasn't something that I was born with, right? It wasn't a physical thing. And I think that when you see that in other people, it can challenge how you feel about yourself, right? It challenges where your own gender comes from, and you can see people responding to other people's choices or how they show up in ways that seem personal, and I think that's why, right? It's challenging.
Yeah, yeah. One good example of this is a person who I'd actually forgotten about, who made the news, several years ago. I'd totally forgotten about her, which is Rachel Dolezal.
Dolezal, I believe, yeah.
Dolezal. Tell us her story, because I think the way you describe her story and her notion of the self and how much who you are depends on the consent of other people out there. It's a pretty fascinating tale. And truly, as I said, I had forgotten about her. So tell us the story of Rachel and what it teaches us about selfhood.
Yeah. So Rachel Dolezal, I'm going to say these in a way that some people, when I finish this, they might be not happy about, but I'll tell the story in a way that is the way it kind of unfolded. So she was a Black woman who lived in Spokane, and she was really interested in issues that affected the Black community, and ended up being the head of the, I believe, NAACP out there. And then one day, someone confronted her about her identity, and it turned out that she was born to a white family. Like, her parents are both white. She was raised as a white girl, and she, as a child, by her account, always thought of herself as a Black person. And so as she got older, the way she looked, the way she dressed, the way she engaged, it all moved towards this kind of Black identity. And people in the Black community, again, accepted her as such. And everyone thought of her as Black. And she had a Black husband and had a Black child and ran the NAACP and her local NAACP chapter. And so the question is like, what does that tell us about race? What do we make of that? And I argue there's kind of the three options. There's one, which is Rachel, and her claim was that like race is more than just what you're born as. It's like what you accept personally. That's a simplified view of her position. I think of myself as black. I've always been black. It doesn't matter that I was born white. I'm black.
Right.
So it's kind of a personal choice. The second is like a version of what many of the people who are really upset thought. You're born what you are, and you misrepresented that.
Mm-hmm.
You're white. You're white when you were born. You're white now, and you presented yourself as black, which was not true, and people were angry about that. And there's the third option, which was what I argue, is that she was born white, she became black, she was black, and then she became a not black woman. She was no longer black once she was not accepted as such.
Okay, so let's stop there. So when you say she was black, like that can be like for one of the groups, for many of the groups you're talking about here, that's a controversial claim. Like, why was she black? Like under the Lowery theory of selfhood, why was she black? I actually buy it. I have that. I mean, if you look at my notes, like that was one of my like big like underlying takeaways. That exact section right there, because I think your analysis to me is nuanced and accurate. But let's dilate on it just a little bit. When you say, here's this woman, she has two white parents. All right, I have two white parents. Right, she has two white parents. She says, but I really feel black. Okay, so that's her. So she has her self-identity there. But then, at a certain portion of her life, you say, I'm quoting you back, she was black. Why?
Yep. Because, okay, I'll give you my answer and I'll say a little bit more about why I think that. So she was black because, in my mind, to be black is to honestly believe yourself to be black, to sincerely believe yourself to be black, and to be accepted as such by the black community. That's it. That's what there is, right? There's no, in my mind, the rest of it is adjacent, like not unimportant, but not definitional. And in the book, I get into more detail on this, so I don't want people to, I mean, because it's just that alone, I'm sure it can raise hackles for some people, but what I really do is push on like, what does it mean to be black? Define it for me, right? And then I give all these examples where you're like, okay, here, if it's to be raised in a black way, what if there's a white child that's adopted by a black family and their full experience is like a black experience in terms of their childhood being the way they were raised? Are they black? You know, what if, and if it's alternatively, what if a white family adopts a child that clearly presents as black, but they've only been raised by a white family, they've been in the right white community, all their mannerisms, all those things read as white to people. Is that child black? And then you can just start playing with genetics. Like, okay, what if you're 5% black? Are you black enough?
Right.
Is it? So you just, when you start these definitions, they all kind of run into these problems where mine, I think, is pretty clear. Like, it's a social idea. And so that means that it's defined by social interaction and social belief.
It seems like it has two components, and I think it's actually really useful, and you know, this country has been dealing with race since before it was a country. I think it's become even more challenging now because you have the dividing lines are less stark. Because and you talk about this law in the 1920s about whether a Chinese immigrant is a white person, and we're seeing that revive right now, which is like is someone of Hispanic descent. Is that person? Is, you know, are Hispanics whites? There was a time, you know, where Italian Americans were not considered white, right? But I think your definition is actually really powerful and helps us make sense of this complicated world. Because what you're saying, in my interpretation, is there are two dimensions of it. One, what do I believe about myself? Two, how do other people see me? And with Rachel, she had the first one, I see myself as black, and then for a moment, other people saw me as black. You got both components, you're black. Is that accurate?
That's right. Like, and I guess another way of saying it, here's a metaphor I think people can imagine, can easily accept. These groups are like a family, right? You're in the family if the family accepts you as being in the family.
That's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Right. So if somebody's adopted into the family, they're still a member of the family. You wouldn't say they're not really in the family.
Of course.
But okay, yeah, they're adopted. How they got there is not relevant. They're a member of the family.
Right.
And I think people then get upset because on the Rachel thing, the other reason they get upset is they feel like she got into the family under false pretenses. Right. And they're like, you know what we mean. It's like, I guess. But what I would say there, and this is I don't spend a lot of time defending this. I would say it doesn't matter why you accept the person. If they're accepted, and that's what matters. And I get people can be very upset about how she got accepted.
Yeah, but again, if you have these two things, it's basically if you have somebody saying this is who I am, and then the community of which they claim to be a part says yes, we see you at that way. You have both components. With her, she had this sort of crazy life where she basically decided that she was something that superficially she might not have been. The community in which she claimed to be a part said, yes, you are that. Then the community changed its mind and essentially rescinded that. And so she needed two components here, and she lost one. And that's the way it works. And I think it's actually just a really brilliant way to think about sort of what we are, because you can't be you say this explicitly multiple times. You can't have an identity on your own.
Mm-hmm. It's a social thing, right? Identity is a social thing, so you can't do it by yourself. That's just what it is. I think that's the part that makes people deeply uncomfortable, right? Like, I am who I am, independent of anyone else. Like, well, no, you're not.
Right, which is, I think to certain ears, it almost resonates as kind of un-American. You know what I mean? Because it's like you have this, you have this sort of individual notion that I am completely 100% self-determined, when you're actually not. Who you are is determined in part by other people. That's why I think it's just so interesting, because you start looking at yourself. Go back to that mirror question. You start looking at yourself in different ways. I mean, you also say that we bring, all of our relationships to every encounter. Mm-hmm. All of our pre-existing. So this is a very crowded conversation then, you and I, right?
Indeed it is. Indeed it is.
So, but tell us what you mean by that, because I found that super interesting. I think the metaphor of that is super interesting. That when I go into an encounter with somebody, it's not me necessarily. It's not me as this sort of essential, integral, single figure. It's the accumulation of me and all my relationships coming into that. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, what I say is, like, whenever you say I, you really should say we. I mean, you don't think of it that way, but that's the reality. And I'll stick with gender, right? Like, how do you know what it is to be a man? When I interact with you, I assume you're a man. I interact with you as such, but you bring what it means for you to be a man from your world, right? Like, how does that constructed in your world, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm interacting with. And similarly, when you interact with me, it's like, what does it mean to be a black man? What does it mean to be a professor? All those things.
Right.
It's like a cast of characters that are constructing that. And that's what you're engaging with to some extent, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no way you can engage with someone without engaging with the social world they come from. I'll say that's something I think people find more, it's maybe interesting. Every encounter you have with another person is an encounter with a whole nother world. It's a whole nother world. That's an amazing thing when you think about it.
It is.
It really is. And I think people sometimes take that for granted. Like, it's an amazing thing. You talk to someone else, it's like they live in a whole different world than you live in. Like, wow. The window into, like, what's possible and what you don't see and what you're not a part of should be amazing.
And the knock-on consequences of that is that when you encounter that other person, the encounter itself, the experience then changes who you are. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't want to go completely woo-woo on people listening to this yet, but, like, the person I am when we started this conversation is different from the person who I'm gonna be when we end this conversation.
Yeah, and I mean,
because of that encounter, that there's something kind of beautiful about that.
Mm-hmm. Every moment, every interaction is a moment of creation, like both in both directions. It's amazing. And what's funny about this is when I talk about it, sometimes I'm like, I fear this is going to sound woo woo. And the thing is, like, I'm the least woo woo person you will ever meet.
You're a scientist. That's the thing. You're a scientist. You're a social psychologist. You teach at Stanford GSB, for God's sake. Okay, like that's not touchy feely. You know?
No, I'm not. People that know me would be shocked to hear anyone call me a woo-woo person. Not
Yeah.
only that, I'm not generally an optimistic person either. So I'm not like rainbows and fairy tales. That's not
Right.
generally my space.
Right. Now, so when it comes to so do you know what you get sort of like pop relationship advice? You have to say, people say, oh, in order to have a meaningful relationship with someone, I don't mean romantic relationship, any kind of relationship, you have to actually know yourself first before having that. But I think you might disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, what I disagree with is what they say about what is know yourself. What does that mean? People say
Yeah.
that without thought, right? Like, what is the self you're talking about exactly? So if you wanted to say like, know the world that you come from, know the world that constructs you, like, I think I'd be okay with that. If what you mean is know your internal core, now I don't know what people are talking about. Same way I say like, I don't know what authenticity is. I don't know what people are talking about.
Right. Right. I mean, I think, but wouldn't you say that there is essentially no, stable, essential internal self to that's just another way of saying what a core is. That
hmm
it's in flux, it's socially determined, it changes over time, and
And thank goodness, doesn't that make life fun?
yeah, but it also, I mean, but arguably you could also reframe that as growth in a way. Like
hmm
I don't want to be the same person I was when I was 3 years old. I'm glad, or when I was 33 years old. I'm glad that I, at some level am different.
I mean, I hope I am. Like, I hope today is different than tomorrow, that I'm a different person. I certainly hope so. I mean, I hold out the possibility of growth, even though sometimes I wonder.
Yeah, I hear that. So let me come back to freedom here for a moment here, because I think that one of the things that's interesting is you sort of push back on the idea of that human beings actually truly want a lot of freedom. And you also say a very provocative line here. You say, the line between compulsion and choice is fascinating and far less sharp than you might imagine. I was tempted to do this whole interview is basically find 10 provocative lines, just read them to you and say, please discuss. So let's do it that one. All right. The line between compulsion and choice is fascinating and far less. So I think that's interesting. But far less sharp than you imagine. So the line between compulsion and choice. So do we have freedom? Do we want freedom? Do we need freedom?
Um, I don't know that we need it. No, I don't know what it would mean to need it. Um, I think we want the feeling of freedom, which is different than wanting freedom, and I make that distinction in the book.
Right, exactly. Explain what you mean by that. I think that's actually a really useful distinction.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where the reason I don't get into free will is because it's super technical in philosophy, right? Like, what exactly do you mean? A lot of it comes down to definition, and I just find that wouldn't have been a useful excursion, I don't think, in the book. But if what you mean by freedom is like, I want to feel like I decide things in my life that matter, sure, you can have that. But if by freedom you really mean, I want to be uninfluenced by other people in the situation. I want to know that some internal essence of me is deciding free from influence. Like, that's probably not possible. And even if it was, you don't want it. And I think that sometimes people think that's what they want. And I'm like, no, that's not what you want.
Yeah. Yeah. What is it that we want? We want affiliation, we want stability, we want a mix of things, and it depends on who's looking at it. What do we want?
We certainly want stability. I think we want the world to seem orderly. We want to feel like we can predict what's going to happen in the world. I think that is a precondition for a sense of safety and security, I think. So I think we want those things. I think we also want to feel like we are consequential. Like, we make decisions. And I think that's where the freedom comes in, the sense that I chose. And that I think people want to have that experience. I choose. I matter. I make a difference. And I don't know that I'm challenging that, but I think the way you understand it has to be maybe tweaked for most people.
Yeah. I'm going to come back sort of a little bit out of order, so forgive me, editors out there. But there are two studies that I found super interesting, and I'd like to have you talk about them. The first study that I found really interesting, one of the many studies that I found really interesting, was the study of people playing a computer game that involved throwing a ball to each other, and then explain that study, and then what happened when you excluded people from that study, or you excluded people from the game.
Yeah, so it's this game. It's like it's an old set of studies, and it's on studies on ostracism. And so what you do is you have people kind of sit at a computer screen, and they have an avatar, and people are tossing a ball back and forth among, let's say, 3 people. And eventually, you just start excluding one person, and you look and see how that person reacts. And in essence, people find ostracism incredibly painful, and some studies have even found evidence that it looks, if you look at people's, let's call it brain patterns or patterns of brain activation, it looks similar to physical pain, like social exclusion.
Yeah.
So people are very sensitive to not having that social engagement or being excluded from social engagement.
Okay, so but then I think what's really interesting is that then they gave the people who were ostracized a test.
Oh, so like, 'cause there's a bunch of these studies. This is why I have to remember which one we're talking about.
That's okay. So ostracism, yeah, there's no question. I mean, I think that's actually fascinating. So here is this game. You're throwing a ball around on a computer, and two essentially strangers exclude you, and there's actually an injury there. That just shows you like how deeply we want that kind of affiliation, and how much ostracism hurts us. But then it actually, I think this goes partly to sort of how freely determined we are. Then we give people a test having to do with conformity and what happens.
Yes. Oh yeah, and in those tests, then people conform more, right? So and sometimes they might even give the answer they think is wrong if it connects them to people in the group. Because I mean, here's the thing about those studies: they are a powerful demonstration of something that people should know, and maybe in individualist societies we try to pretend is not true. We need other people. We are evolved to be in communion with other human beings, and we need that. And when we don't have it, we try to repair quickly. And the way I talk about this when I teach executives is like, look, human beings are soft and weak. You will not last very long by yourself. Historically speaking, without a community, you were literally dead. And we still feel that today. We've evolved to be terrified of being excluded from the social community. We are intensely social creatures.
How do executives react to this? I was curious. I did want to ask you, not only executives, but your GSB students, when you talk about this topic. I mean, how do they react?
I often talk about it in the context of power and influence.
Okay.
I think they see it, right? And some of these things are so hardwired, we can just do little demonstrations, they will feel it. You'll give examples of violations, and before you explain why it's a violation, they laugh because there's discomfort, because they know intuitively, like, that's not how it should work, or there's something odd about that. I mean, it's the sort of thing where we are responding to the world in this way, and what I'm doing sometimes is just giving language to that. Like,
interesting.
This is why you're responding that way. That's why it feels uncomfortable. This is why you're afraid. Like, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Now you also, so among the many provocative things you say in here is, you know, not only do you talk about selfhood, but you also talk about the very notion of a nation state. So you're going from the sort of like the micro to the macro, and you say it might sound strange to suggest that nations exert more influence on the self than, say, life partners or family. So, okay, so let me read that again. You say, I'm quoting, it might sound strange to suggest that nations exert more influence on the self than, say, life partners or family. And my notes to myself is, yeah, that does sound strange. What do you mean?
All right, think about marriage. How many people are out there like chasing marriage? I don't know these days, but like structuring some portion of their life around finding a marriage partner or mate for this. Why? For this legal construct. It's not, you can find, there's all sorts of ways to find people to have in your life. There's all sorts of ways to have romantic partners, all sorts of potential ways of managing romantic engagements or sexual engagements. There's nothing necessary about marriage. But nation states or outside entities have created this because sometimes it serves their purposes for any number of reasons. And it shapes not just how you think about marriage, but how you organize significant aspects of your life.
Absolutely.
Right? And you don't think of that as the nation state, but you could. You could think of that as the nation state. I mean, what I say is that it's not just that a nation state creates laws that limit you. Nation states create ideas and concepts that change what you can even conceive of.
It changes. I mean, the nation state, which again, I think a lot like contemporary human beings tend to think that a nation state, the idea of nations, sort of emanated from nature. That has always been there. Always been nations, which is absolutely not. It's something that human beings created for a whole set of reasons, whether it's administration or social order or whatever. But I mean, I think one of the things that sort of this book is helpful on is some of the arguments, even the vitriol the United States is dealing with right now, which is essentially when you have a nation state, you then and your membership in that nation state is part of who you are, part of yourself. Who you admit into that nation state becomes a big issue.
100%. I mean, and you can see this all over the world, especially right now. I mean, as we speak, there's a war going on in the Middle East, that was just initiated. You think about the nation state, and as it becomes definitional, then you have to kind of guard those boundaries, right? Like the same way you want to guard the boundaries of your family. Like nobody can just come in, right? Because it changes who you are. If you are in part defined by your family or your nation, then who comes into your nation has an effect on who you are. You can feel alienated from your own nation because the people coming in seem different from you in a way that's problematic from your perspective, whatever reason that is. So it really becomes very personal, even though at some level you see people being upset about immigration in places where there's not even very much immigration, might not even know any immigrant, any person that's immigrated there, and they're still has very strong feelings about it because I'd argue it's about who they are as a member of that nation that they're concerned about.
I think that some of the writing and analysis you have, I think helps. You don't go explicitly there, but by talking about the nation state and by talking about the nation state being essentially a construct that, for better or worse, determines ourself or who our self is at the moment. Because if you were to ask me, if you were to ask me, who am I think that being an American would be pretty high on the list of, but like, what if I lived, 200, 300 kilometers, 400 kilometers to the north, and I just think about somebody who's born on one side of the U.S.-Canadian border, the U.S.-Mexican border, and not. It's like this border is a fiction in a way. But I think that a lot of what you're talking about goes to some of the vitriol in the United States, because I think a lot of the vitriol in the United States is rooted by some people saying, I know what an American is, and some of these people out here who I'm seeing, they're not really Americans.
Yes. And I think, I don't know, I might have had to cut this from the book at some point, but a nation is a people. Like when you think about it, that's what a nation is. A nation state is just, the state is what's added to the kind of the infrastructure, the legal systems, et cetera, that you build around the nation. But a nation is a people. When you think about it that way, it can change your understanding of what the country is, because the people, who are the people? What people? Like, we make that up. We decide who they are. And then we reinforce the boundaries, right? And over time, those boundaries can start to seem natural, even though we constructed them.
Okay, so this is, I want to wrap this up with a few other questions here, just to make sure we cover these things here. So you have another uplifting line here where you say, we all live in and contend with the shadow of nothingness. So you have a whole chapter on meaning. So tell us, what are your thoughts on meaning? What is it? Why is it important? And how does it connect to the social definition of the self?
Yeah, so meaning is, there's a lot of actually research in social psychology on meaning. And meaning is the sense that, I'm going to say this in a way that isn't circular. I don't probably won't. It'll be circular. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
That life matters, right? That we matter. That there's something that's beyond this moment, right? And the reason it's a little bit circular is because to have meaning, the research suggests you need three things. You need three things. You need coherence.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a sense of who you are in the world and the way those things work. You need purpose. When you get up, there has to be something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you need, and this is often considered the most important, you need significance. Or another term they use for that is mattering.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, you need to feel like there's more than just the present moment, right? It's not all absurd. The universe is not absurd. You do stuff and it's all forgotten. Who cares? And the reason this is relevant to the self is it certainly is really critical to the first and the third. So the self is the way most of us have coherence. We talked about gender. It's like it tells you like what kind of clothes to wear, what people expect of you. Like it tells you something about your place in the world, right? The self, that's what the self is. So it provides coherence. And this is the one I find most interesting. I think the self kind of works as a time machine. It allows you to think of the past as relevant to you, right? Like your ancestors, your family that existed before you were born, like you think those stories are important and matter. So it allows you to think of yourself in the past, and more importantly for meaning, it allows you to project yourself into the future.
Interesting.
Because I'll stick with nation for a second. If you think that you're defined in part by the nation, as long as the nation persists, some aspect of you persists. So the self allows for something you could call symbolic immortality.
Ooh.
Right? Like to the extent that things you are connected with continue to exist, if those things really are a part of you, not just something you connect to, but in part define who you are. If they exist, then you continue to exist. And here's the goal, going away from the woo-woo, there are studies that show things like when people think about their own imminent death or the fact they will die, they often show a greater commitment to those things that are connected to them, like their country. Like there's a study that shows, for example, if you ask people, how long do you think the United States will exist? And people give you a number, 500 years, 3,000 years, whatever. How long do you think the United States will last? People who are thinking about their death and think of themselves as an American give you bigger numbers.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So this is not, even though it sounds like, oh, just woo-woo like this, you can see people, even though they don't articulate this, they demonstrate that it's kind of the way they live their lives. Like they care, even if they can't tell you that they care or why they care, but you can see it.
This is why you have people who use the word legacy. I mean, you're right about that. I mean, it's
yes.
It's like it should be theoretical. It should be like, well, why do you care? You're going to be gone. Why?
You'll be dead. Why do you care?
Yeah. But no, I want to leave a legacy, and that's interesting. All right, so at the end of this book, so this is a very thoughtful, interesting, provocative book. It really made me. I had to actually put it down and stop and think multiple times.
Thank you. That's one of the best compliments I've received. I love that.
And then it's like, then I get to the final chapter, and I'm like, okay, so you say, and I'm like, okay, I start thinking like, what do I do with this insight? All right, I've had this kind of rich intellectual experience. I've been rattled a little bit about who I am. I've started like looking at myself in the mirror differently. Then I say, what do I do with this? And you say, the truth is, I don't think it's my place to tell you what you should do with it. But is there anything? Is there anything is there guidance here on how sort of to lead our lives in a daily way? That if we're rethinking where the self comes from, how if at all does that change us or change what we do? Forget about changing us. How does it change what we do? How should it change what we do?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you the first answer, which is the one that I give my editor, and then I'll answer your question in a way that I'm typically forced to. First, I would say, if were reading the book and you put it down to think about something, or I'd love to think about like being on trains. You stopped and closed it for a second and looked out the window and contemplated something. Like, I feel like that's enough, right? I feel like you will be changed in ways that I can't describe to you. Like, I don't know how that changed you, but if you did that, I'm pretty confident you will have been changed. Now, what I think people want is some sort of like, tell me how I should do something with this. that becomes harder, and that's what I usually resist. But here, I'll give you something anyway.
Okay.
Um, and this is more the reason I don't like this. I'll just give this caveat is because it's more woo woo and abstract than I would like. But here goes anyway. Every moment of contact you have with someone is a moment of creation. You're creating them, and they're creating you, and you're creating them in return. We don't take those interactions seriously enough. We behave as if we're islands, bumping into other people, and everyone has responsibility for themselves, and that just is almost certainly not true. And you are missing an opportunity if you don't take seriously that interaction. Again, as I said this earlier in our conversation, every interaction is a window into a whole nother world. And I don't think we have enough awe for that because we don't see people in their full complexity, right? We don't see everything they bring to bear. We somehow think we're the only protagonist in every interaction we have, right? These other people don't have lives, and the world is full as ours. And for that reason, we leave something on the table in interactions. So what I would say, I guess, is take seriously the responsibility you have in every interaction you engage with, and also understand that those things are changing you as well. And just that awareness, I think, will change the way you interact with people and change your experience of life in a significant way.
I think that's great, and I think that's actually super useful. And I have to say, it's like that is a way that I think that this book, for whatever, it's a unit of an N of one, your mileage may vary, but for me, it did make me think more about interactions. And actually, I had this conversation with my wife. She said, so I was telling her about the book, and she said, actually, no joke, she said, "What do you? Okay, so what do you do with that?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure, but I think one thing that I will do with it is recognize exactly that an encounter you have with somebody else actually changes them and changes you, whether you want it or not. And you can bring a degree of intention to that, and that you can say, like I want this encounter with someone else to be enriching to that person. And I think that what it, at some level that it does is that to me if you think in this way, you might actually act with greater kindness. You might actually act with greater empathy. You certainly will act with greater curiosity. And so when we think about kindness, curiosity, empathy, that's pretty good. And so if it gets people acting that way, I think it's a big win. But regardless, this is an absolutely fascinating, at times mind-boggling book. It's Selfless, A Social Creation of You, written by Brian Lowery of Stanford Graduate School of Business. Brian, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Dan.